Um, yes, welcome. We are going to start. We're still missing one panelist. We're hoping that that he's going to join us very soon. But we have a little presentation to start with before we get to the panel. Welcome here to Dakar Bacon House, which has been housing us, ODI, for this week. I'm Hans-Peter Lankes with ODI Global as Managing Director. And we're really very, very pleased to have you here on this topic of blended finance, which interesting when you look at this week here at the spring meetings, it's popping up everywhere. The whole question of private capital mobilization seems to dominate events, be it in general or be it for climate. I've been personally at least at 5 or 6 different events that were looking at private capital mobilization. It's sort of the one thing that seems safe these days to focus on. Interest in private capital is not new. We know that going back quite a few years. Maybe it was given officialdom with the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and there's been a very vigorous effort to develop vehicles, schemes in order to mobilize private capital since then. And a lot has happened over these years, and blended finance has always played an important role in that. Now, interestingly, despite that sustained interest, the data don't tell us that there has been an increase in blended finance. In fact, some of the data say that there was sort of a peak before COVID and that it actually came down. It depends a bit on where you look. When you look at the MDBs, the story is a bit more positive. But when you look at figures, say, from Convergence, it doesn't look that positive. So the question is a bit what's going on there and why isn't there more of it if there's such an interest in mobilizing private capital? And there is this story that blended finance can play that key role in getting private capital off the sidelines by de-risking investment propositions, getting investors to go where otherwise they would not go. Now, one of the issues there is, in my mind, and I've been working in this space for some time myself, is that we don't actually know very much about what blended finance achieves. We know quite a lot. We set up systems about what we wanted to achieve. We look at things ex ante, and there's a whole elaborate set of principles, and you review things, and you know what you want, where you want to go. But there's an astonishing lack of serious information about what has been achieved and whether what has been achieved required blended finance. And the biggest unknown for me, but also the biggest prize with blended finance has always been that you change not just a particular project, you don't enable just one project, but you change a market. You have sort of the thin end of a wedge that requires some help at entry, but then develops the market and makes it independent of subsidies in the future. That's the idea, that's the theory. We know very little about market creation with the help of blended finance. And that is not to say that it doesn't exist. So my hunch is, looking across the many projects that we now have, that there are lots of good success stories. But we don't really know that much about them. At least that's from where I sit. There have been lessons, sort of in the course of time, there have been lessons, the need to target risks at source so that you don't waste blended finance, the need to ideally take a programmatic approach. Those are things that we have learned, that we have been discussing. And even there, I find, I remember myself, bringing that up in my early days at IFC, which is now it's many years ago, that we needed to have a more targeted approach. We needed guidance for that. There was work, and I saw Nancy Lee, I think, before. So we worked together at the time with GDD, trying to figure out whether one could develop a guidebook for targeting blended finance, and it never really got off the ground. And on programmatic approaches, this has been in the songbook for a very long time. And there we don't really see that coming together either. The idea that you should be strategic about the use of blended finance Otherwise, it becomes sort of a scatter shot approach. And if you want to develop markets, which is that big prize out there, that you should do so in a systematic way. So there too, it seems that we weren't really able, based on those lessons, to develop the right guidance, and we don't have that much knowledge. And it'd be interesting to hear this today about what was actually achieved. So those are the topics. That's the background for today. And we're going to start with a presentation that's based on work that ODI Global has done over the past few months. There is the paper is not out yet, but there is some evidence that emerges from that. And so we're going to look forward to hearing what Sam Attridge and Frédéric Daron have to say. And after that, we have a fantastic panel, actually a very large panel. So we're going to have a very executive approach in the panel that of experienced people in this field, and hopefully we can elucidate these questions. So with that, I will pass it over to Sam, Frédéric first.
You've got a double act. Okay, so thank you, Hans-Peter, for setting the scene so well. So this is a study, comes with a health warning. It's not finalized, we're kind of, but these are emerging findings which we think are important to inform the discussion today, I guess, and test the water with some of these findings. So this study was actually commissioned by Norfund, the Norwegian DFI. And as Hans-Peter said, the promise of blended concessional finance has offered a lot of promise. And we've got these principles, and a lot's been written about what it is, but we really don't know a lot about how these principles have been operationalized, how it's being deployed, and its effectiveness. So when it works best or when it's not so effective. So we set out, we were set a very difficult exam question to explore this issue, and we looked at it through the prism of financial additionality, which made it even more complex and challenging for us. So what we looked at, we wanted just to say, is that we focus on blended concessional finance. So there's lots of people talking about blended finance, and here this study is really about sub-commercial ways of working and using concessional finance to do that. Quite often it's actually reported as ODA. And we were asked to look in sub-Saharan Africa in 3 sectors: the financial institutions, in agri-value chains, and the renewable energy sector. And we selected 9 case studies in those sectors in sub-Saharan Africa to try and understand the structure of these transactions and the financial additionality, as well as, importantly, the context in which those investments took place, and then trying to look after, as well, as Hans-Peter was talking about, this kind of the large end of that wedge in terms of market creation and the pathway to commercial sustainability, because there is this huge evidence and knowledge gap. And I think that gap assumes even more significance now, with ODA being cut. Recently, we had the 7.1% announcement in the fall of ODA, and many believe that we've seen, the peak of ODA. So in this ODA constrained world, we must ensure that we get the biggest bang, for our buck on how we use ODA in this way. So that's kind of our exam question. And so, as I say, today we want to highlight 5 emerging observations, which I think raise policy questions for donors who provide this kind of capital, but also for MDBs and DFIs, which we think in this new era deserve, opening up this black box. But before we go into those 5 observations, it's important at the beginning to state 2 general observations that we found. And that was that in every case study we looked at, that their DFIs, and this includes the private sector operations of MDBs that we looked at, do demonstrate a very strong consideration of project level impact ex ante. There's no doubt, you know, that they are ex ante, zooming in at the project level. And actually, in all cases, we found evidence of financial additionality. But I would say in some cases, it was kind of difficult, and I think you talked about this, Hans-Peter, to conclude concretely on issues around maybe the rationale and the minimum concessionality kind of framework. The investment was additional, but we couldn't really conclude on kind of the use of on concessional finance. So as I say, we've kind of got 5 observations we want to road test, I guess, with people today.
Thank you. And the first one is the one that Hans-Peter was alluding to just before, is that market demonstration and systemic impact. And although we have not carried out a robust evaluation of our case studies, we didn't have the ability to do so, we were struck by the disconnect between the market level ambitions of the transactions and also in the way it's embedded into the DFI blended finance guiding principles that make ample reference to market sustainability and addressing the sector obstacles, and the largely transactional focus in practice. That was quite striking. And so success, really, the way that DFI typically measures success is the impact at the transaction level and not at the sector or market level, not even over time. Now, maybe there is a thinking and a plan over time, but it's very hard to understand this plan from publicly available sources. And so it raised the question of how we define success. And do we define it at impact at the transaction, or are we looking for broader, as the principle would suggest? The blended finance concessional operation we looked at did address critically important constraints, such as local currency financing, but we were not always clear how the consideration of market development was deeply ingrained into the structure and the way it was deployed. So it felt maybe as a sort of gap filling rather than a plan to move a market. So, you know, we think that to realize the catalytic ambition of blended concessional finance that Hans-Peter just mentioned, we probably would want and need to see a more strategic, coordinated approach. And maybe to illustrate concretely, in the financial institutions case study I've reviewed, it was very interesting to see that in parallel to what the DFI were trying to establish, you had government-sponsored institutions, often themselves supported by MDBs, trying to achieve the same objective, which to me raise the question of whether there is a vision for a tighter collaboration down the lines rather than parallel track. And if it is parallel track, that suggests perhaps a missed opportunity, something I think worth exploring. The second, which of course is very related to the first, is that we sense that the blended concessional finance was often very transactional and siloed. And that, again, is problematic. So, for example, the deployment tend to be transactional rather than strategic, with limited coordination between DFI and also other stakeholders. So again, going back to the FI sectors, some of the operations that are trying, of course, to tackle the SME access to finance, where the gaps are typically very large in sub-Saharan Africa, we found that DFI MDBs were typically targeting specific sub-segment in across a diversity of operations, but often transacting with the same financial institution that itself transacting with different DFI. So it does raise the question, how are we expecting those financial institutions to change internal processes and systems to accommodate different products? It feels that the vision is there, but practically how it would look like is a question mark, certainly for external participants like ourselves. And we wonder, and of course this is highly perhaps a bit provocative, but this is what a think tank does. We wonder whether there is always a deep understanding that DFI should really focus on their comparative advantage. And in particular, if a DFI is able to offer a particular product on commercial terms without engaging concessional finance, maybe that DFI has a comparative advantage compared to another DFI that will offer the same product, but for which, for probably risk appetite and risk management, need to combine with concessional finance. So these are question of system functioning here.
So the third observation that we found, this kind of came out of the cases that we looked at primarily in the renewable energy space. And an observation that we had was, if you like, the predominant funding model in this area in renewable IPPs appears to be quite debt heavy, usually kind of equity around 20 to 25% and the balance of debt. And that when concessional finance was deployed through debt in these kind of IPPs, it means that it's essentially subsidizing that kind of project and the finance over the life of that project, which could be 15 to 20 years, including when it's operational and the risk is lower. And so we think that this raises questions about, are we targeting concessional finance to the where it's most needed, where risk is highest, for example, around project development and around construction, which limit pipeline development, and arguably where the ability to mobilize private capital at those phases is probably more limited. And so what we thought we came across in our case study was the Climate Investor One model, which is a blended facility with 3 funds, a development fund predominantly funded or 100% funded by donor grant money, an equity construction fund, which is a blended fund which finances the construction 100% by equity. And then once the asset is operational, there's a commercial refinancing fund. And we think that that kind of model is actually quite a good use potentially of targeting a very scarce resource. And there are a number of benefits here, particularly in terms of project acceleration, where some of these assets were being built and operational within 2 years versus 3 to kind of 5 years. So we're kind of, I guess, asking the question, can we be thinking better and more systemically about how we target the use of concessionality to address big bottlenecks, especially around the limited development of pipeline out there. The fourth observation we found, this observation came out of some of our case studies where we looked at the agri-value chain. And here we kind of thought the cases that we looked at basically showed kind of that whilst the concessional support again was impactful at the firm level, the project level, we thought it might raise issues around market neutrality, potentially around market distortion, especially in some markets which are highly concentrated and where the concessional finance was directed to very large players in a concentrated market, some or all of them who had good access to commercial financing. And so we're wondering whether or not kind of, I guess you're kind of picking companies, offering them, essentially they have preferential access to concessional finance, which may not be available to their competitors who are operating in similar regulatory and operational environments. And so again, this kind of market kind of creation thinking through what's the exit, because a number of these cases that we looked at have had repeated MDB and DFI investment, not all of it concessional in the past, but how do you wean off companies from concessional financing? And then our fifth observation.
And the fifth is on transparency and the learning, but also the donor practices. So there is a lack of transparency. There is very little available publicly on those operations, whether it's their the level of concessionality, the detail of a structure used, the rationale for concessionality, and the agreed outcomes. There are definitely DFI that are ahead in terms of transparency, but for some, there is absolutely nothing out there. But even those that are quite advanced in and publicizing typically do not report ex post about the outcome in detail. And we completely understand that there is an element of confidentiality that applies. This information cannot be made fully public, but we would really want to see a greater openness among trusted shareholders, certainly among a group of DFI operating in the country, in the sector, so that there can be some learning. Where are we with a sector transformation? How successful has this product been achieving its goal? And if it has been successful, can we scale up and double down? Because that clearly is the way by which we can achieve market transformation. Those discussions, to my knowledge, do not happen and need to happen for greater accountability and learning. And we think that donors sometimes weakens actually the impact. So donors do not provide concessional finance under the same conditions. Some donors actually price the concessional finance, even in a discounted manner. For other donors, this is free. And that also means that it makes extremely hard to compare apple and oranges, because the donors' conditions have been different. Some donors do not provide much flexibility in terms of instrument. So, for example, concessional financing limits the type of concessionality that would apply in a transaction, which of course cascade down to what the DFI can actually offer in order to address the obstacle. And maybe that connects to the choice of instrument that are put in place. So that's, I think, donors have to be part of a solution, absolutely, especially for scalability. And I think we need to see more learning opportunities. Something that was quite striking during our studies and investigation is the disconnect between the theory of blended finance, and there is quite a lot of literature, and the practice. And we think that it's also part of the fact that there is no feedback loop. So when structuring deals, investment officers fall back on the theory without being able to rely on lessons learned from past operation, of which they must be by now quite a lot. So that's something we would like to discuss. And on that,
yeah, so I'll hand over to Hans-Peter, and the panel will pick up on some of these observations. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Sam and Frédéric. And now I invite the panel to come to the table. Okay, that works. All right. Thanks, panel, for being with me. You all work in this field, and I hope that this presentation gave a provocative context. Some of these projects that stand behind these lessons may be familiar to you, or I think you've done a good job trying to hide which projects these are. But I know from myself that several of those went over my desk when I was at the IFC. And so I felt in the firing line. But I think there's a lot of food for thought here. And I would like to start with a question on, let's call it the strategic deployment of blended finance and to the extent to which you in your work are considering the impact of blended finance and the why and the how from the start. And with that, I would like to turn to some of you now. By the way, I should perhaps say that we're going to have 3 rounds here of questions and interventions, which we are going to keep very short. By the way, we haven't kept our intro short enough, but so we will keep this very short, and then we'll open up and have a discussion. Yeah. So on this first, the question of the strategic use is a questions to David, to Banji, to June, and to Iftin. And I think maybe I'll present you as we go along. What is it that defines strategic deployment of concessional finance in your view at the project, at the market, at the system level? How do you ensure that resources are targeted where they're most needed, where they're most impactful? And how do you consider the context in that respect? And maybe David Kuiper, who is the CEO of EDFI, the European Development Finance Association, you could give us a start.
Thank you, Hans-Peter, and great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I was a bit because I hadn't seen the study and you haven't published it, so I was a bit scared in a way that what I had prepared may have been completely off to what your findings were. But it was not so. You mentioned, oh, sorry. It was not so. You actually, in my case, you mentioned Climate Investor One as a successful one that went off my desk. So at the time, so I'm happy that that happened. I was working at FMO at the time when we actually tried to attract the various concessional finance funds for Climate Investor One from the Green Climate Fund and from the European Commission, Dutch government, USAID. And your question actually, and the study itself, I have a problem, I must say, with the word strategy and the word strategic. Because what I feel that you show is that these deals or facilities individually are effective. But strategic effect takes place at a higher level. Strategic effect takes place more at the level of the instrument, for instance, the IDA private sector window or EFSD plus guarantee instrument of the European Commission. And there I see very little effect in a way, because every strategy kind of needs a strategos. So it needs a unity of purpose of everyone to actually go from one place to another and effectively reach the strategic goals. And in the case of blended finance, you're combining so many different interests, combining so many different instruments, that at the instrument level, the strategic effect, I think, is quite low, and which could be one of the reasons that in your numbers, you still see a lot of individual effective deals and facilities. But at a higher level, no strategic effect, and therefore no scaling up, no replication, no in a sector or in a geography. So I think we may have a problem there at that level, while the individual blended finance operations tend to be quite effective in their goals. The instruments itself, the programs, may not be that strategic. And this has been compared earlier. I think it was after the annual meetings, we went to New York to the Financing for Development conference in the first PrepCom or the second PrepCom. And at that point, someone said in another panel, we're all very good at baking one bread at a time. And what we need is a bakery. And I do think that we have beautiful breads, all very exquisite and even different, more like a patisserie than a bakery. But what you do need is a bakery at that EFSD plus level, at the IDA private sector window level, and that will help scale this up and actually get a strategic effect in sectors and geographies where you want to have it. So that's my very first observation on this.
Thank you very much, David. And it would be good if, sort of in the course of the conversation, we could also think about solutions. How do we actually do that? Because it's a really difficult thing, how to connect individual transactions, the work of the investment officers, client-driven, how to connect that with a strategic approach. That's tricky. With that, Banji Fahimtullah, who's Executive Board Member and Head of Financial Services at the African Finance Corporation. Thank you, Banji, for joining us. Same question.
Well, so I work for Africa Finance Corporation, and I would say, we are one of those entities that kind of is on the other end of the stick, more or less, because we have to finance ourselves in international capital markets, but we're in a continent that largely needs a lot of, support in terms of concessional funding to get projects off the ground. So what we see, in the field is we get into projects or we're trying to do a project, but due to market failures, those projects cannot close unless there's someone that is willing to take some kind of risk that the private sector, unfortunately, doesn't want to take or is just not comfortable taking. We see that a lot in the energy sector. You mentioned Climate Investor One, where we partnered to do a 60 megawatt project in Djibouti, a wind farm. Getting that project to financial close was so challenging because the initial startup capital just wasn't there initially. And, we had to eventually think of how we could deploy the equity, essentially equity, construction equity, which we did with Climate Investor One. So for me, when I look at, aid and concessional funding and how relevant that should be, it's really helping us, the strategy for me must be, how do we crowd in private capital using that, private capital that is scarce to a continent like Africa? How do we use concessional funding, blend it with the commercial funding that we have to make projects viable? So I think that's at the project level. But at the market level, I think that's even more important because we need to find a way to ensure that, the continent and just the industry is self-sufficient, doesn't rely on concessional funding all the time. And the only way to do that is to develop markets. So I give an example. One of the biggest challenges Africa faces today is cost of funds. Africa pays about $4.2 billion annually in higher interest expense simply because of media stereotype. That's a market issue, and I think it's something that we've talked about at AFC. How do we solve that problem? But I'm not sure we have the capital, or the funding. So a good use of concessional funding could be, how do we correct the media stereotype so that the industry works better, the market works better for a whole continent, right? So I think when we start thinking about strategic deployment of, concessional funding, we should be thinking of how do we make projects happen? How do we make markets to become more efficient so that there's less and less reliance on concessional funding going forward? I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Banji. And now with the same question again to June Park, who's the head of blended finance at the IFC and a former colleague and familiar with at least some of the projects in this study. How do you approach this from a strategic angle?
I think it's working. Thanks, Hans-Peter. How much time do we have? I'm just asking so that I can measure time myself.
For this one here, 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Can I just maybe have a quick show of hands in terms of how many of you have had direct or indirect experience in blended finance? Okay, so that's more than half. The reason I'm asking is because, for IFC, blended finance is relatively new in the sense that the formal team has only been developed less than 10 years ago. So there is, a couple of things that I want to mention. One is there is a learning that we're doing. And number two, just to manage expectations, I want to mention that it's not a silver bullet in terms of solving issues, right? There are other challenges that, we need to solve through. And because blended finance, has a different definition for many institutions, some people call it transitional finance, catalytical finance. For IFC, what it means is that we're using concessional financings that we've received from donors in order to, number one, de-risk projects so that when we work in non-investment grade countries or projects, we are able to put IFC's own account at risk. And number two is, as Hans-Peter mentioned, the PCM, which is private capital mobilization. We can only truly say that we're not over-subsidizing if we're actually crowding in third-party commercial investors, which I think Banji was alluding to. So there were questions about, at a project level, market creation, systems. So at a project level, again, we want to make sure that there is as much third-party commercial investors as possible. But at the same time, let's really recognize that, we have, representatives from BlackRock here. Even if we say we're going to give you 30 million of subsidy in Yemen or South Sudan, which is a fragile conflict country, it's going to be very difficult for them to get through a process, investment committee or board approval. So sometimes IFC would be the only FDI in a very difficult country. So we need to balance and put a little bit of context that not all countries are the same. The priorities such as climate, it could be gender, it could be food security, they're all different. So again, just want to put that into context that we do have a system internally within IFC, which does what's called a AIM score, or measuring the expected impact that project will create, not just for that project, but for the market creation aspect as well as the system. So just to give you an example, we have funding from UK, the FCDO, which is called MAGIC. It's green buildings, and we use that like a PBI or performance-based incentive to incentivize developers to consider doing green buildings versus non-green buildings, right? So that level of subsidy is just enough to tip them to make sure that we're encouraging them to develop green buildings. And to your question about how can we make it systemic, the percentage of subsidy, and this is what IFC discloses in the public information for each project, we have reduced that over time as we did more projects, for example, in South Africa. So the level of subsidy level has to go down eventually, because we're not in the business of public welfare, right? We want to make sure that it's supporting the project, also recognizing again that there is a time dimension to it, right? We cannot expect a fundamental systematic change with one project. It's going to take time. And therefore, after 5 projects, when we think that there is sufficient, for example, 15% of developers are doing green, we would actually say we don't support any further projects that are green buildings in South Africa. So let me just stop there. I think I went over 2 minutes, but that would be important.
No, perfect, perfect, June. Sam and I, we like to distinguish between frontier and market strategies in blended finance. And it's kind of useful to keep that in mind. The purpose of blended finance is just not the same in each of these, and we cannot expect the same. We cannot expect to mobilize a lot of capital in true frontier situations. Like Banji was mentioning, in Djibouti, you cannot expect a huge amount of blended finance in there, or Yemen. But you should in others, and those are the market situations where maybe we're going to hear from Matt a little bit further, more sort of middle income country type situations. With that, to Iftin. Iftin, who is the senior program officer, Iftin Fatah, sorry, is senior program officer at the Gates Foundation. So you're looking at blended finance from a slightly different angle. You actually provide it. You provide blended finance to institutions. You've also sponsored quite a bit of research in this area. So it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on this, the strategic use of blended finance.
Yes, and thank you for the question, and fully agreed with the comments thus far, particularly Banji's around the need for capital markets development and how ultimately the solutions need to be more around market creation. So at the foundation, obviously we come at this from a different angle. We're obviously a health-focused foundation. So for us, blended finance represents a means to an end, the end being equitable health and human development outcomes. And obviously, health impact sector receives very little in terms of volume around blended finance. So particularly within the countries that we operate in or that we prioritize. So this remains a very tricky and kind of challenging subject, but we view blended finance from a few different lenses, right? So as Hans Peter mentioned, where I sit in development policy and finance, we really fund research and analysis around how to improve the blended finance ecosystem more broadly. We have some partners in the room, and I will be sure to highlight their great work. And then also on the programmatic side, whether it be through our health, agribusiness, women's economic empowerment teams, we have teams that are actually participating in blended finance transactions within the overall capital stack, right? So we have these different kind of levers that we wish to employ, but ultimately it's really about building out the ecosystem around blended finance. So in terms of the project, market, and strategic or systemic levels, I would say at the project level, considering a lot of our emphasis is around health and innovations around health, we really look to de-risk these interventions or these projects such that they're able to attract private capital that they wouldn't otherwise normally be able to attract. At the market level, we try to address failures, whether it be through fragmented supply chains, weak health infrastructure, lack of access to capital, and providing technical assistance around policy and regulatory support in that vein. And then from the systematic standpoint, we really want to try to, as best as we can, align our investments around national health strategies or national health priorities. So we find that to be most effective. And overall, whether it be through research or actually providing, concessional capital within blended finance transactions, we look at three main angles, whether it be additionality, without, if not for our funding, would this financing have been achieved? Scalability as well as replicability, and I'll talk to that a bit later throughout the course of this event, as well as through an equity lens, meaning are we reaching the most marginalized populations in some of the countries that we work in. So those are kind of like the decision points that we take in terms of how we view blended finance from the research kind of ecosystem additionality standpoint, as well as from the specific transaction standpoint.
It's good, and you bring the impact angle in, and the connecting impact and blending, and of course that is what we also heard from June and others is it should be the driving force behind blended finance. Let me take a different tack, and that's looking at the extent to which blended finance is crowding in private capital. June, you said it crowds in. We should widen our lens. In some situations, we should be crowding in just ourselves and cannot expect much more than that. But to what extent it is crowding in, the market? To what extent it might actually be doing the opposite? And there are often questions around that, as you know, and we heard that from in the presentation. And I would like to go to Letitia and Matt for that first, since you are the market, and be kind of good to hear your perspective. Letitia Ferreras Astorqui is Director of Development Finance at Allianz. Is it Allianz Global Investors? Allianz Global Investors. So Letitia, your view on, just from your experience, on whether blended finance, crowds in, crowds out, have you been seeing positive examples of each?
And thank you for having me here. So yes, I think the simple answer, if there is one in this topic, is yes, blended finance has worked and continues to work in the past. I do agree that is not a silver bullet. I don't think, maybe to put it out there, because when you see my title, like I do blended finance, everyone thinks that I think blended needs to go everywhere. I don't think that's the case. I think that blended finance needs to be thought through quite efficiently, effectively, and in a very nuanced way, which I know is not very helpful when we're trying to look for big solutions that are cookie cutter and we want to come up with something that is perfect box and fits everywhere. But unfortunately, I think for this topic, we need to be a bit more, thoughtful about where we apply blended and why. I think one point that I did want to mention, and I don't want to overcomplicate the concept of concessional finance, but we also seem to, when I speak about blended finance, and I'm part of an investment team that specifically is focused on structuring funds that are blended and deploying those funds, that there's an understanding that every capital that we get from public sector is effectively zero return. Take the capital. If you never give it back to me, no worries. No, I mean, that's literally never been my experience so far. I think the concept, there is capital that is concessional in the sense that effectively requires very little return, not even sub-commercial, but very, very little. And that is rare. So very, very, very rare. I think there's also capital that comes at the kind of first loss that could be considered concessional according to the ODI study, but it is still a return. It might not be what the hedge fund would demand to be in a first loss position, but these institutions are still looking for a relatively healthy return. So I think that's also something to think about when we think about concessional capital and blended finance. We're not necessarily asking every potential provider to give capital at zero return, because that is definitely not sustainable. So maybe that's one point that for us has been quite an experience, that we have effectively, as an organization, Allianz Global Investors, we manage 4 blended funds across debt and equity. And I'm working on our latest fund as well, and working with a few, first loss providers. And much of the discussion we have is around return. So what do they require for their own cost of capital? So I think that's something to think about. And it does, I mean, effectively it does work. We have 2 funds, one of them with IFC, and the other one with FMO, and they are deploying. We have managed to source, each of them is $1.1 billion. So I think that investors very much are interested increasingly interested in blended finance. They see the ability to de-risk their exposure to be quite important, in terms of we're not quite ready to go into full emerging markets and take on the full risk. But if we manage to structure something that has this de-risking, we're willing to look at it. So I think that works. Ultimately, I think the challenge that we face is just a lot of education. So more like, what is blended finance? Why can it work? And also targeting the right investors. I think there's investors that are quite conservative and are not quite ready to talk about emerging markets, and others that might be I would say the few that are ready to invest in emerging markets, no blended, I don't need any de-risking, I'll take the risk. And I think that's my point around being nuanced, and yes, trying to create replicable and trying to create simple structures, but also being a bit more thoughtful about where do we need blending and how much. And I get that question all the time. Great, we'll have a fund with 10, 15% first loss. Why 15%? And we have to demonstrate that, like, this is where we're coming from. This is why investors require this much. And we'll talk about, data and transparency a little bit later, but I think ultimately blended finance does work. It's just that it's quite slow. So to the point on some of the market effects, I don't know if the question is not is it happening or is it just not happening yet? So maybe that's something we can discuss.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm going to turn to you, Matt Kaczmarek. You are managing director at BlackRock, and another user of blended finance, but also a market player. And so, taking the same question here, do you see, framing it slightly differently, do you see more money going in the aggregate as a result of your ability to utilize blended finance than you would otherwise? And how do you know that?
Good question. Thank you. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I lead emerging market infrastructure credit for BlackRock globally. I should say, for the record, our CEO is rather colorfully on the record as talking about the investment opportunities in some of the more frontier markets that specifically some of the ones June was talking about. But aside from that, I think the overarching comment I would make is that we tend to view blended finance as an outcome as opposed to a tool. And even the private capital mobilization that it's often intended to accelerate is also viewed as an outcome rather than a tool. And so for us, as we have launched our emerging market credit, infrastructure credit business, the question is, there's obviously a huge financing gap in emerging markets for infrastructure in particular, but it is not part of traditional institutional investors' strategic asset allocation. And the question we asked is why? And that's where blended finance as a tool can become helpful. And like Leticia, I look at the platform level as opposed to structuring individual projects. But I think that there's specific factors that make blended finance an effective tool that is true at both the project level and the platform level. Essentially, you have three levers that you're trying to pull, right? You're either trying to change the relative value of the investment, because every investment decision by a private investor involves trade-offs. In order to invest in this project or this fund, what am I giving up in terms of risk and return and other potential investment opportunities? So you're either adjusting that, or you're adjusting the risk profile of the investments, which is particularly true in higher risk emerging markets, whether that's real risk or whether that's just a perception of risk that you believe blended finance can help you overcome or prove otherwise through the development of a track record of success, or you're changing the price. And I think price is the hardest one, because that's where you're definitely distorting the market impact and potentially getting yourself into an unsustainable situation. Any opportunity can become investable if you have the right incentive or the right risk reduction. But the question is, how long can you sustain that for? And the three examples where I think blended finance can truly be a helpful tool and where we have sought to use it is, number one, where private investors have been unwilling to take the risk, again, either because they perceive that the risk is higher or because it really is. Second, that instances in which the risk is mispriced clearly, and you just need to do some demonstration projects in order to prove that that's the case. Or third, when you see a market that should be there, such as with emerging market infrastructure, where the gap is truly there, but you don't have enough first movers to be able to accelerate the development of it, where blended finance can help incentivize that early movement.
Great. Thank you very much, Matt. Now, I want to bring the same question, but a slightly different twist to our DFIs. And that's, so you look at this crowding in, crowding out question from the perspective of competition for projects. And I think we shouldn't kid ourselves. There is a lot of competition for projects in the DFI sector. When there is a good investment opportunity, you get more than one DFI that would congregate. And we have seen cases where blended finance was used as a competitive tool. So the question there, crowding in, crowding out, was blended finance really necessary, or was this part of a competitive toolbox? Bunji, your experience.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. Although my answer may be disagreeing somewhat with your premise, because from a continent that needs, 150 billion annually for infrastructure investments, and if you think about the cost of just repairs and just keeping the stock going, that could easily be 250, 300 billion per annum just to catch up with the rest of the world. So within our world, our MDB space, we created another word, which is not competition, it's called a petition, in the sense that we are all cooperating in order to move the needle. I did an interview months or a year ago where I said you probably need 20 AFCs, for us to move the needle on the continent in terms of infrastructure. So from the part of the world I come from, we see, yes, there are a few transactions. I think to that extent you're correct. But really, at the end of the day, hey guys, we have to do this together. So I think for us, there's a lot of cooperation within the MDBs and also, within people who provide concessional funding because we need them. So we launched what we call ICRF, which is Infrastructure Climate Resilient Fund. We had to go to the GCF to get concessional funding, which is almost like a first loss within the capital stack in the fund. So for us, really, given the scale of development that is required, we see less of competition. We see it in the renewable space sometimes when there's a lot of money being thrown into that. But again, we're Africa's largest owner of renewable assets. Despite that, we still find a way to create a niche for ourselves and where we can operate within the capital stack in the project. So I think in my view, yes, there may be what looks like competition, but in Africa, it's less so because there's a significant need, for investment. So it's less of a problem.
Thank you, Banji. Same question to June. Even I just want to throw this one thing out there. I said at the beginning that blended finance, at least as measured by some sources, plateaued somewhere in 2018, 19. It didn't really go up. Actually, by some measures, came down. And the question was always why, if there's so much interest in this space. And it was never a big chunk of ODA. It was something on the order of $3 or $4 billion out of 200 billion of ODA. So why doesn't it go further up? And there's resistance in the ministries that provide blended finance. Why is there this resistance and this question? Is our ability to demonstrate that it's being used and not used in an impactful way rather than wasted plays a role there in that debate. So that's why that question is really quite relevant. So crowding in, crowding out, competition, June.
So as mentioned, I think there are lessons learned, and I think it's irrefutable that there was competition. There is still competition. But at the same time, I think we also need to recognize the changing landscape in terms of donors, right? Significant number of traditional or conventional sovereign donors who are primarily Western Europe are facing fiscal constraints. We know that UK has had to cut their ODA by more than half because it's nominally at 0.6% of GNI, which has gone down to 0.3. But of that, 0.1 plus is actually something that they've already committed. So in reality, it's more like 0.5 down to 0.2. So we have to recognize that the supply of blended finance is going down. It will continue to go down unless other pockets such as philanthropists step up. But at the same time, as mentioned, there are lessons learned in the sense that for IFC, where there are public tender situations, we do go through a very robust process where there's a blended finance committee. The four vice presidents who are the most senior members of the management team get together and evaluate the percentage of subsidy. So take an example, IFC in Africa did the scaling solar, which is to create a platform approach to creating solar. But at the same time, IFC would be involved in the capacity building, working with the governments, but eventually, towards the end, when there is a replication that's been done, The Blended Finance Committee, and I've been involved in this decision making as well, where the blended finance project was not approved, right? Because the vice presidents thought that we don't want to see this over competition. So we want to make sure that there are safeguards. So what I meant by was, I'm sure there was competition in the past. There may be competition and there will be competition, but I think hopefully from our perspective, it's going down and we don't want to actually participate because again, we have very finite donor funding which we can use. And as alluded by our panelists, most of the blended finance products that IFC has is returnable. So what does that mean? So if Canada, UK gives us $50 million of funding, there is not a commitment, but an expectation that after the 7-year cycle, principal plus interest will be returned, right? So from the likes of Canada's perspective, what they're doing is giving us such as climate, food security, so that it's known to the development space that Canada has contributed to this. But there's also an expectation that after that 7 years, that 50 million plus, interest will come. So just to point out that we don't deploy blended finance with just because we have so much of it. We're deploying it because there is that need. And we do it carefully because we don't want to disappoint our donors 7 years later, where we have to tell them, well, actually the 50 million, there was no commitment in the trust agreement, so we're now just giving you, $30 million back or $40 million back. So the last point is, I think it's what you mentioned, we probably will be discussing is transparency. So I'll stop there, but I think transparency among DFIs is also important because that just gives that framework for lessons learned to be shared. As mentioned by that MAGIC program in South Africa, we've reduced the percentage of subsidy. If we have that information across DFIs, we can do the same.
Yeah, and we're coming to transparency, but on that point, having also been on that blended finance committee, the information isn't always there to really make that decision in a fully informed way. And so that's one of the difficult things, and that's why I always felt, guidance, practical guidance to assessing whether something is well targeted, whether it's necessary, would be very, very valuable. We never quite got there. It's really difficult. Yeah. David, same question.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat what was said. Actually, I want to build on what June just said. What does this mean for the future? Because I do think that IFC actually has quite a robust way of working through a blended finance committee, and at least having the building up the narrative among professionals in IFC around why this is maximum additionality with minimum concessionality. That's basically what we're looking for. And I do think that we all have a role as DFIs and MDBs to improve the governance of that. Not that we all need to have a blended finance committee. I actually think blended finance committees are a step towards making sure that this question of maximum additionality and minimum concessionality becomes an integral part of the investment decision as a whole. So the investment committees in the DFIs need to take this in a prominent way in their decision-making process. And to connect to what you just said, Hans-Peter, on yeah, it's difficult to get the right information, and I would caution for an accountancy approach on this, because it takes a lot of time and resources of the entire system to get this really right if you want to put this into numbers. You can have a narrative on this. You can have, of course, with the help of some data, you need to have a structured process, but an investment committee in a way is also just a decision-making committee on the basis of narratives with the support of data. So do not use your time and energy and resources to get it really right and to get all kinds of numbers and models that can get you to the exact right point where there's maximum additionality and minimum concessionality. That's that's laudable in an academic way, but not when we are in a hurry. And we are now in a hurry. So make sure that the process of decision making is far more transparent and that the process is robust and embedded in the governance, the existing governance of DFIs and MDBs in a central place.
Very good. Decision making under uncertainty. And that leads us to transparency and the final round in this group. Here I would like to start with Letitia again on this question of the visibility or disclosure around concessional finance. Would that, if there were more information, would that make it easier for you and to take those decisions? Do you think there is enough information? What is it that's missing?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, the answer is yes. There's two things actually that I wanted to mention in terms of transparency, like maybe two buckets, if you will. The first one is transparency around what's available. So meaning when we think about concessional capital, when we think about whether that be at a project level, fund level, there isn't really right now any kind of repository, if you will, of this is where all the potential concessional providers are going to be waiting for you. You come, you make a case, kind of like a Shark Tank almost, you know, and then, you know, Germany raises their hand and says, yes, I'll give you X amount of money. I'm joking slightly, but it would be extremely helpful to have that transparency in terms of this is what's available, this is the budget, this is the criteria that this budget needs to be dedicated for, whether that be sector, whether that be, you know, specific regions. This is more or less what structures it can support. So this is project level, equity, debt, whatever it needs to be, but transparency around availability of concessional capital and what it seeks to do would actually save an enormous amount of time. And I'm really speaking from experience where right now asset managers that are looking at doing blended finance need to be knocking on everyone's door, and every 6 to 8 months, because of course representatives change and budgets change. So even you might have to talk to the same government 3 times in 2 years because their programs might change. So I think transparency around that kind of availability of capital and what they're looking to do would be extremely helpful. And then the other bucket, if you will, is the transparency around data that we've been discussing quite a lot already around performance. And it goes to Matt's earlier point of what are you solving for and how do we, on the basis of that, what do we show investors and what do they want to see? And I think when you think about institutional investors, they like information and they like data that makes sense to them. So it really goes down to this is the performance in the past 30 years. I mean, we've been talking a lot about GEMS database. I think we don't need to hammer that point further. But it has been extremely helpful. And I can't say that we have used all the disclosures that GEMS has done in the past year and a half. It has been extremely helpful to talk to risk departments and various investor levels, including Allianz that had already invested billions of dollars in blended finance. We were able to go back and say, and this is why we can make this more efficient. If we have more data, we need less concessional capital. And I think one of the things that I did want to mention maybe as a wrap up is that we've seen it live, actually. When we talk about whether this is working, whether blended finance, the idea really is that we won't need it, that we will be sitting here in 20 years and not talking about blended finance anymore. That will be maybe less than 20 years, ideally. But that's really, I think, the goal for all of us. And we've seen it with Allianz, for instance, as our parent company, where they invest in blended finance, but they actually more recently gave us a mandate to invest directly in emerging market private credit, non-blended, and in countries that are, I wouldn't say frontier, I wouldn't say, but they're sub-investment grade. So they're almost like testing the waters, if you see what I mean. It's not the volumes we want to see, but it really shows that they have been able to build their track record and see, okay, well, this is actually not as bad as we thought. So let's start thinking about maybe in 3 to 4 countries, maybe we start with LATAM and then eventually move to Africa, to Banji's point. But we're seeing a little bit of that effect. So I think transparency around that level of data also makes a huge difference.
Okay, great points. We are kind of out of time for the panel, and therefore, can I ask you all to kind of limit it? I think Letitia basically said it all, right? So limit it to some very brief interventions, so half a minute each. Matt.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Leticia said, and I love the image. I think there's a market opportunity for an MDB or another organization to bring together concessional capital providers and create that shark tank, if you will. I'll share two provocative thoughts. The first one is that to the extent that MDBs and DFIs are providing capital into investment opportunities that can get market-based financing, I think that is the same trade-off that you face of how much capital do you want to deploy in concessional terms to mobilize private capital in stretching that risk curve further. And the question should not necessarily be, can you get private capital to invest on the same terms that you can, but how much private capital can you mobilize to develop that market? And that is where, you know, financing platforms versus individual projects, demonstrating, building track records, providing that data that we talked about, streamlining your frameworks, making your organization easier to work with and more flexible across a wider range of investments can help you get more investors on a more sustainable and repeatable basis.
Great. Thanks for being so brief. Iftin, to you with a question, what can philanthropy do to push this point and to help it along? This question of transparency, which is, you know, obviously with us. What can you do? What do you do?
Yes. So clearly, philanthropic capital is not going to plug the concessional capital gap, right? What we can do is we can ensure that we can leverage the scarce concessional capital that we have and push that as far as we can. As far as what we can do, we can obviously leverage our convening power through our support of various initiatives, transparency initiatives such as Publish What You Funds, Great Transparency Index that really encourages DFIs to report more on their operational performance and impact, as well as promote standardization initiatives like convergence, work around standardizing what has worked in blended finance through identification of set models that can be replicated and repeated going forward with the intent that standardization leads to more volume as far as blended finance. So those are ways in which we can kind of move the needle, but recognizing that we really need to leverage the scarce dollars that we have and ensure that there's more reporting and more data around this, because for investors, such as the ones in the room today, past is prologue, and having that granularity and data is key for them to participate in these transactions. So thank you.
Fantastic. Now, our three DFIs, what more can you do to provide that transparency, to contribute to that learning? David?
Yeah, thanks. Well, particularly what Iftin says here, we play a role as EDFI at the European DFI Association to help standardize the indicators that are being collected from our investments, to help standardize the decision-making process. And that is quite key, that you, with the 15 DFI members of EDFI, plus the 2 affiliate partners in USDFC and FinDev Canada, that we actually come to an ever closer or an ever increasing standardization. Second, what is quite important is to actually start, and that's almost like a low-hanging fruit, I think, on improving the interface, the data interfaces, because we have a feeling that a lot of data may be public, but is just collecting dust and is not interpreted right. And maybe also with the help of artificial intelligence, you can do a bit more, but you need to almost do a bit of a cleanup of what you do and bring it to light. It's already public, or there is no impediment to make it public. Because the impediments to make things public is commercial confidentiality, of course. There's all kinds of other confidentiality that we all know about. But we do have a feeling that there may be a lot of data around that is actually collecting dust and not being used well. And that's really a waste. And as you say, the standardization and that opening up how would I call it, the passive data, that would be really, I think, a big step forward.
Great. Yes, Anjay, over to you.
So I largely agree, and I think as DFIs, we owe the industry a duty to ensure that we're providing information. So that's the transparency point that was made earlier on. And I think it's really in everyone's interest that there's enough data and, and people know the impact of the funding, the donors know what the money is doing, what is catalyzing, and et cetera, et cetera. And so for us at AFC, for example, we've made this part of what we do, annually go around the world. I'm having one of those sessions in London on Monday where we're just talking to investors, stakeholders about success stories, because I think success begets, further success when people know what you're doing and what has worked and what has not worked. So I think that amount of transparency and information to investors, and even on our websites, just have as much information so the researcher can get to know what's going on, at a click of a button becomes extremely important, because we're on the field, we're the ones deploying the capital or mobilizing the capital. So there's a lot of cross-learning. In fact, we can also tell people what not to do. So it's not just about what to do, even things that don't work. So I think that responsibility is on all of us as DFIs, because we are a major stakeholder within this ecosystem.
Thank you, Banji. June, you have the last word.
Yeah,
20
so
seconds.
mindful of time. So very quickly, so IFC does disclose the subsidy amount and the percentage of the subsidy as a project cost, but we do agree that there should be more uniform disclosures because, again, we're faced with a dwindling donor funding, and we need innovation to make sure that every dollar is stretched to mobilize, third-party capital investments. I just want to mention that private sector, unlike public sector, as you know, one thing is that we're very cautious about sharing client confidential information, and people sometimes say, "Why can't you share that?" The reason is, I think there was a point made about ex post. The reason is, if you have three competitors in an industry, and one of them, discloses sort of what the ex post in terms of, for example, mobile carriers, reach, et cetera, that is actually information that is being divulged to that client's, competitors. So we just need to be mindful of that fact as well, that it's not just, not trying to disclose, but we have to protect our clients as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, panel. This was very rich, and you even managed to make up a little bit of time in the aggregate, but still we're sort of down to a very brief period of interaction with our participants here. We have those in the room, and then we have a large number, I'm told, online. I cannot see them, unfortunately, here, but I have one question from online, which I'm going to come to. Maybe we should go to the room first. And could I be sort of a proactive moderator here? Because we have Gary Foster and we have Sally Paxton in the room, the experts on transparency. You take this, what you've heard here. What would you say? What would you ask?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is working. I'll sit this side.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gary Forster, CEO of Publish What You Fund. Thanks for putting on this fantastic panel and doing this research. This shares our reflection of looking at the levels of transparency around blended finance, around private capital mobilization, around private sector DFI transparency more generally. The next index, which Iftin mentioned, the next ranking is out at the end of June. A question for our IFC colleague. So one of the things we've looked into is client concerns around transparency relating to these deals. Obviously it comes up often that clients don't necessarily want this disclosure, or that things are commercially confidential as per the contracts that have been agreed between the DFI and the client. So we spent a lot of time over the last few years talking to those clients and talking to mobilized parties, pension funds, equity funds, a real mixture. And our sense is that the evidence is that in most cases, they are actually willing, in return for concessional or below market or all the other great things that come with these deals, to forego a certain level of confidentiality. So my question to our IFC colleague and maybe to others on the panel is, do you, deal by deal, do you have that conversation with the client? Do you say, look, it's important for us to demonstrate impact, it's important for us to demonstrate additionality, et cetera, and have that conversation and develop a kind of bespoke agreement with them? Or are you just kind of using the same non-disclosure each time? Yeah, that's
Great. Thanks, Gary. Maybe you hold the thought and we take a couple more questions from the floor. Manfred?
Yeah, I just want to comment, if I may, because I'm the chief executive of a company called ILX, and we co-finance with the MDBs in a non-blended structure for European pension funds. And I just wanted to sort of comment about how we were created, because we were created with help from the German, Dutch, and UK government to incubate what we are and to allow us to gain access and utilize data of the MDB system. And our thesis has been about that the MDB system or DFI system needs to scale up, and the scaling up can only happen in a very transparent manner, standardized manner, and harmonized manner, and at a level that we can find partners who can share the risk in the same way. Because our thesis is that we will only be able to scale up the level of finance if we can find the same risk capacity in the private sector that is within the MDB DFI sector. So we worked on over the past years. We went live 3 years ago. We now manage 1.7 billion on behalf of 5 pension funds in the Netherlands and Scandinavia. And the concept has been proven. So I just want to reflect upon how we then look at blending, because we find it incredibly important that the market growth and creation is not distorted by subsidization or concessionality. No markets work effectively if there is an element of concessionality that is also at play. You get distorted movements, asymmetric movements of parties. And so, while blending, we understand our thesis is to only work with the MDBs and DFIs, so we only work with public finance. So there is an element of blending involved because of the privilege that the MDB system has, which we effectively get as an investor without paying for that. But the role of blended finance that we see on the one hand is maximum transparency where blending is not needed, and to avoid a concessional distortion in that marketplace, which is very much around the middle income. Easy. I think some of the comments made by the panelists that projects that don't need concessionality shouldn't get it, and to allow that to be replicated. Where I do see a need for concessionality, and that's where we think the focus should be, is on 3 areas. One being, of course, there's many regions and countries that are off limits even for those that can share the risk of the MDBs, which is related to post-conflict or in conflict like Ukraine, or very difficult countries like low-income countries. It's at certain product levels where we benefit greatly from the concessionality and the grants provided at the project level, just in general in terms of the pipeline. And lastly, it's in products such as local currency and equity, which we see opportunities where the transparency of data is not needed. So I think I just want to make the clear point that it's very important to allow markets to scale on transparency and not be intervened with concessionality. Thank you.
Thank you, Manfred. Yes, do we have another quick?
Yeah, I'll make it fast. So I just wanted to throw a little bit of a provocative. I'm Devin Chesney. I'm with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We are a network of people who support entrepreneurs around the world and in the Global South. So I just looked up while we were talking. I expected to see some of this data in what was discussed today, but I didn't. How much does a dollar of concessional capital mobilize? Convergence's report from about a year ago said that about 55% get less than 3x, and the amount that gets more than 10x is about 15%. And so in the conversations about what's the best use of a development dollar, whether blended finance is at the top of that stack or not, I think is a pretty important question to answer. The thing that I would point out from our perspective is there's 2 sides to building markets. There's capital and then the entrepreneurs to deploy that capital successfully. It's very easy and popular to talk about ways to mobilize that capital. It's far less popular and less money goes into supporting the entrepreneurs that could deploy that capital successfully, especially in low and middle income countries. And we have evidence that actually high performers in that space get 10 to 12x return on investment on the grant money that they deploy, which would be a better investment than the average blended finance transaction. Why is this such an imbalance? Why is there so much focus on one side of solving that market problem and so little on the other?
Great. Thanks. One last question, and I would have reached out to you, Joanne. Please come in, and maybe you could also partly address the question that has just been raised. How much does blended finance actually mobilize?
Yeah, it turns out, hi, I'm Joan Larea, CEO of Convergence Blended Finance. It turns out that the very large transactions tend to mobilize at a much higher leverage, like 1 to 9 as opposed to the standard of 1 to 4. By the way, that 1 to 4 includes a couple of dollars of DFI capital, put out the door on commercial terms. So it's actually less of a good number than you would think. But leverage is all over the place, and I really don't recommend it as the only way to measure something. And I think we all would agree on that. I just wanted to welcome ODI's attention on all of this. It's my day job. It's probably not everybody's day job, blended finance, except for people like Jun who think about this all day as well. But 2 points that you're focused on, I think, are dead right. Number one, ex post data. I come from the private equity community. I know that comparables are everything. When you go into an investment committee, and perhaps BlackRock and Allianz have comparable experience. So how deals turned out from a returns point of view for the senior capital, that commercial capital, is incredibly important. Please keep digging. Second thing, you're on the right path. I think we do a disservice talking about the size of the blended finance world, because blended finance should be a path to a non-blended finance world. So that longitudinal look at what blended finance spins off is very important. I think if you look at microfinance and renewables, you will find some good stories, narratives. We need to figure out more of those. The ILX experiment perhaps is one where you used blended finance to get something stood up, which now operates commercially. So thank you.
Thanks. And in fact, you're referring to market creation experiences that we perhaps should be able to discover and describe better. I have one final question, which is from online, from Thierry Bux, Senior Advisor on Private Sector Engagement at the Swiss Agency of Development and Cooperation, for Sam and Frédéric. In the case studies you looked at, how was the issue of minimizing the level of concessionality operationalized in practice? In the absence of any transparent benchmark, what is the operational relevance of this principle, besides being very intuitive? And with that, we have a number of questions, and we have 1 minute each for our panel. You please choose what you want to respond to. Can I start with you, Banji?
I'll just share an experience of a transaction we did, kind of answers some of these questions. So ourselves, the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Nigeria, and I think Garanco, and as well in the UK, many years ago, about 7 years ago, decided to create a guarantee company that would do local currency in Nigeria. And at the time, obviously, we financed it with equity, but our rate of return normally would have been higher, but we had to forgo that simply because no one was going to set up that company except someone decided to put concessional capital in there. 7 years later, this company has a AAA rating, has mobilized 4-5x from pension funds money, which otherwise was invested in 90-day T-bills. Now they're buying 20-year infrastructure bonds. And on the back of that, they've created a huge market whereby infrastructure transactions that never would have happened have all of a sudden happened. So for me, it's such success stories that we talk about, right? For us, it wasn't about return, it was about getting the market impact. And we've created an industry. Now we're going to Kenya to replicate that for East Africa. And we're going to Southern Africa once we're done. So I think when we think about it, the end goal, now we've listed the company and the private sector has essentially taken over from there. So that's the goal, right? A blended finance world leads to a non-blended finance world eventually. And I think there are success stories to share.
A great story. Banji, David, to you. You look at addressing some of the questions that have been raised.
Yeah, and And just an observation, actually, that some of the questions that were raised, what we're missing here is really a government and a good donor representative here to talk about this as well, because there are two large issues, and I'm really conscious of the 1 minute. One issue is a group of issues is misalignment. There's a great misalignment between culture of public-private actors, misalignment between interests. And the other element is complexity. That has to do with the misalignment as well, but it's complexity because you put different instruments all together in a blended finance facility, and these instruments come out of a different regulatory environment, and then it all kind of makes it very complex. So a lot of what is mentioned here is requires really government action to help make the government portion work in these facilities, and that will then help, create at a higher strategic level. On data and transparency, I do think that is the most urgent thing. In the beginning, you said, how do we solve this all? I think it's one of the most urgent things we need to start solving. And it's not just because of the problems that we now see. It's actually, and no one has said it, every panel that I've been to in the last few days says, oh, we're living in turbulent times. So let me say that, we're living in turbulent times. One way to keep ourselves calm and steady is through data and transparency. And now is the time to start working together to actually improve that along the lines that were mentioned here.
Great, thanks. David, Letitia.
Yeah, maybe just a reaction, I think, on blended finance, Manfred, on ILX. I very much agree, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that I think blended finance needs to be used in a nuanced and, thoughtful way. I do think, and I will say that if blended finance wasn't necessary to move capital at scale, A, we wouldn't be here, B, my life would be so much easier, and so would my mental health. So if we really didn't need blended finance to mobilize the majority or many investors, both in Europe and across other regions, I think we wouldn't really be having this conversation. So I think that's part of the point about being nuanced and who needs what and what risk are they willing to take. So that's part of the efforts that I know you're doing with ILX and that we're doing on our end as well. And the point around entrepreneurs, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer, but it is something that we've thought about. And I know that we've talked to the DFIs as well as to some of the incubation labs and what can be done. I think for us, we kind of come from the place of it's already challenging enough to convince emerging markets. If you add the level of very early stage companies, the level of risk just seems to keep creeping up. So we haven't quite figured out how to be able to address all the different risks, to package it in a way that an insurance company pension fund is going to say, you know what, this is something we can do. So I don't know the solution, but personally, I think it would be super interesting to also try to have that conversation. So sorry, it's not an answer, but it's a fair question.
Thank you, Leticia. June?
So I just want to reiterate what Joanne said, that I think it's great for you to convene this because, as mentioned at the very beginning, blended finance is not a silver bullet. So we need all of our collective thoughts to how to really innovate and make sure that I mean, first of all, it's the development challenges that we want to solve, right? So we really have to huddle together and work towards that. So I really want to thank this forum. Quickly to some of the questions, I think, in principle, as mentioned, I'm personally for more disclosures, but at the same time, I think there were some, askings and it wasn't conclusive enough. But what we're looking to is maybe look at, aggregated data, which could be, sort of a way to not divulge, private, confidential information. So we're looking into that. As mentioned again at the very beginning, we are learning as we move forward. Blended finance as a team was less than 10 years ago for IFC. And in terms of mobilization and leverage, what we're finding is that it's actually very different how you slice and cut it, whether it's climate, for example, renewables. I think 15 years ago, people thought, it's too expensive to do it. Now it's, it requires almost little blended finance. So if you look at it, by region, by whether it's climate or other sort of thematics, we see a very big difference in terms of mobilizations. And I think you made an excellent point about not just if we can mobilize third parties, but how much third-party mobilization we can make. So thanks.
Thank you, June. Iftin?
Yes, a lot of learnings, I think, throughout this session. I mean, a fair question from Andy around this point about entrepreneurs, but it's obviously a tricky, square to circle, but we need to recognize where our comparative advantages are, right? I think for an institution like Gates, I mean, we really look at the delivery platform level, not as deeply as we could necessarily on entrepreneurs, but there are other organizations out there, GSG, AECF, that I think could do a better job of leveraging in terms of impact around entrepreneurs. Where we can put our, capital to use, I think, is really drilling down on this issue of data and transparency, recognizing that this represents a key, block around mobilizing blended finance in a standardized way. So I think to whatever extent we can treat data and transparency not just as a compliance feature or some box to check, but really core to the architecture around building around a blended finance ecosystem.
Thank you, Iftin.
My last comment is just the urgency is great, and the development finance world, as we've discussed, is becoming smaller, and private investors are increasingly willing to take more risk as capital markets continue to grow. So if we can get governments to be more flexible, if we can get the MDBs to take more risk and be more creative with the use of their dollars to leverage other dollars and crowd in private investment rather than crowd out, I think the big investors are ready in the right structures. So if we can be clear about our objectives and we can be clear about the outcomes that we're seeking to deliver, and we have credibility in those things, then we should use blended finance to scale very quickly.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. And sorry, everyone, for stretching your patience. We have one last question. That was Thierry online. Sam?
It's a very quick answer. It was virtually impossible to be able to answer that question. I think the IFC is the only one who discloses actually a degree of subsidy. No other MDB or DFI does that. And then to answer a question about a minimum concessionality was impossible for us to do.
Yeah, thanks for being brief. So with that, we're done. But obviously there are so many questions, and I'm not going to do a summary because we're way over time. But just to take one point on this transparency issue, which I really find very, very important, and where I have seen over decades the resistance against transparency eroding, and at every point it was just not possible to provide more. But then a few years later, it was possible, and we've gone down that process. Can we accelerate that a little bit? And can we use the standards that Gary and Sally have been setting on transparency, which have been well consulted, and just make those the gold standard for the institutions, and just do it. With that, I would leave you all, let you all go into your evening. Thank you very much for attending. Yeah.